In the shadowed halls of medieval England, where power moved like smoke and betrayal was a coin often spent, one name would rise above the whispers of court: Hugh Despenser the Younger. Born around 1286 into the noble Despenser family, Hugh was the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a loyal servant to the crown. The Despensers were not the most powerful family in England, but they had always managed to cling to the outer circles of influence. Hugh, however, had grander ambitions. From a young age, he was groomed for a courtly life and trained in the arts of diplomacy, war, and persuasion. But it wasn't simply ability that would bring him close to the throne. It was opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of royal marriage. In 1306, Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, the granddaughter of King Edward I and niece of King Edward II. Through Eleanor, Hugh gained a direct connection to the monarchy, vaulting him into the inner sanctum of the English elite. The marriage was more than strategic. It was transformative. At the time, Edward II was already a controversial figure. Unlike his war-hardened father, Edward I, he preferred music to military drills, the company of favorites to the camaraderie of lords. His first favorite, Piers Gaveston, had already drawn widespread condemnation for his influence over the king and his blatant disrespect toward nobility. Gaveston's execution in 1312 at the hands of rebellious barons left a void in Edward's court and in his heart. Into that void stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger. At first, Hugh's rise was subtle. He served the king quietly, proving his loyalty and reliability in both civil and military matters. But over time, something more intimate began to grow between the two men. Some chroniclers of the age would later whisper a bond that went beyond politics, a relationship that mirrored the intense favoritism once shown to Gaveston. Whether fueled by personal affection or mutual ambition, the connection between Edward and Hugh grew stronger with each passing year. By 1318, Hugh had positioned himself not only as a close advisor, but as a central figure in Edward's personal and political life. That year, he was appointed royal chamberlain, an incredibly influential position. It gave him daily access to the king, control of royal finances, and a say in matters of state. And yet, Hugh wanted more. He began to accumulate lands at a staggering rate, using his influence to press claims on disputed estates and push weaker nobles into submission. Even his own relatives weren't safe. Hugh infamously manipulated inheritances and seized properties from his brothers-in-law after the death of his wife's grandfather. These actions did not go unnoticed. The nobility watched, seething, as Hugh used the king's favor to elevate himself at the cost of others. But Edward, blind to the mounting resentment, only drew Hugh closer. Hugh's ambitions grew unchecked. He began to play a key role in shaping royal policy, and those who opposed him found themselves silenced or exiled. The court had become a place of fear and favoritism, and Hugh sat at its center, whispering into the king's ear. The people, too, began to suffer, with land disputes erupting and royal justice bent to favor Despenser's interests. Unrest spread. But Hugh's confidence only swelled. In 1321, he was granted the lordship of Glamorgan in Wales, one of the most powerful and wealthy territories in the kingdom. His grip on the monarchy was now ironclad. For all his arrogance, Hugh was not foolish. He knew his position was precarious. The nobility had already killed Gaveston for less. He moved quickly to isolate his enemies and bolster his defenses. But every alliance he broke, every land he seized, every insult left unanswered would soon return like a tide of vengeance. Still, at the close of this chapter in history, Hugh Despenser the Younger stood at the apex of power, the king's most trusted, the realm's most hated. But as every shadowed court tale has warned, the higher one climbs, the more devastating the fall. The coronation of influence is rarely crowned in gold. In the case of Hugh Despenser the Younger, his true coronation came not with a crown, but with a key, the key to King Edward II's chamber. As royal chamberlain, Hugh's access to the king was constant and unchecked. He used this privilege not merely to serve the monarch, but to mold him, manipulate him, and ultimately rule through him. By the early 1320s, Hugh had become not just the king's favorite, but his shadow. Every royal decree, every land grant, every political appointment bore his mark. With chilling precision, He replaced loyal nobles with his allies, arranged marriages to tighten his control, and used the law as a weapon to subdue his enemies. He was no longer simply ambitious. He was omnipresent. Hugh's manipulation extended far beyond the court. He weaponized the royal seal, forging documents, rewriting legal claims, and even adjusting the king's own words to serve his agenda. Through his influence, entire estates changed hands. Rival barons found their titles questioned and their legacies erased. What made Hugh's power even more dangerous was his partnership with Edward. Unlike many kings before him, Edward II was not a warrior. He lacked the charisma of his father, Edward I, or the commanding presence of his Plantagenet ancestors. But what Edward lacked in strength, he made up for in attachment. He clung to Hugh not merely out of trust, but dependence. The king was besieged by enemies, abandoned by allies, and mocked by his wife. In Hugh, he found the only person who seemed loyal, or at least loyal to him. Hugh understood this dependence and used it ruthlessly. He isolated Edward from other counselors, restricted access to the king, and fed him a constant stream of paranoia about baronial plots. Edward, increasingly fearful of rebellion and betrayal, leaned harder on Hugh, creating a feedback loop that only tightened the favorite's grip on the crown. One of Hugh's most infamous tactics involved reclaiming lands and titles through legal trickery. He revived ancient claims, dug up minor disputes, and used royal power to force settlements. These forfeitures, as they were euphemistically called, often left noble families destitute. Hugh, of course, was the first to buy the lands at a fraction of their worth. He became one of the wealthiest men in England almost overnight. But wealth wasn't his only goal, it was security. Hugh knew the nobility loathed him. Every coin he collected, every castle he acquired, every title he held. They were fortresses not of stone, but of fear. He hoped to make himself so powerful that no one would dare rise against him. Yet he underestimated just how deeply his enemies hated him. Among the loudest voices of opposition was Queen Isabella, Edward's neglected and increasingly outraged wife. Once a respected daughter of France, Isabella had watched with horror as her husband handed the kingdom over to Despenser. She was sidelined, insulted, and by some accounts, even threatened by Hugh's agents. Her resentment, long buried beneath the silks of diplomacy, was beginning to boil. The barons, too, were sharpening their swords. Many of them had tolerated Edward's eccentricity for years, but Hugh's oppression was intolerable. Men who had once sworn loyalty to the crown now whispered of rebellion. They met in castles and abbeys, conspiring to rid the realm of this usurper of power. Still, for a time, Hugh remained untouchable. The Despensers, for now, both father and son, were granted full control of royal castles, held sway over the king's military campaigns, and oversaw law enforcement across the realm. Any noble who questioned them was exiled, fined, or worse. In 1322, Hugh's triumph seemed complete. After crushing a rebellion led by the powerful Earl of Lancaster, Hugh oversaw the Earl's execution in a display meant to send a clear message. The king's favorite was above retribution, but victory would make him reckless. Despenser's greed continued unchecked, and his punishments grew more sadistic. He reportedly delighted in humiliating rivals, forcing powerful lords to grovel, and publicly mocking their families. His enemies began to multiply, not just among the nobility, but among the common folk who saw their livelihoods trampled beneath Hugh's greed. The court of Edward II had become a court of fear. In those days, a man might walk through Westminster and hear whispers in the corridors, rumors of torture, exiles, and secret executions. Some believed Hugh practiced dark arts, others simply believed he was mad with power. But all agreed on one thing: the king no longer ruled England. Hugh Despenser did. And for a man who had clawed his way to the top of the world, the next step was not up, it was the long fall down. As the 1320s progressed, Hugh Despenser the Younger transformed from a royal favorite into something darker, a tyrant cloaked in silk, with the king's crown acting as a shield and sword. His consolidation of power wasn't subtle. Every title he seized, every estate he absorbed, every noble he humiliated was another rung on a ladder of cruelty that reached into every corner of England. His influence stretched like a creeping fog, suffocating the noble class, poisoning royal justice and sending fear deep into the hearts of once proud barons. One of Hugh's most ruthless tactics was his manipulation of inheritance laws. When nobles died, whether naturally or through suspicious misfortunes, Hugh often claimed rights to their lands by dubious connections through his wife, Eleanor de Clare, or through forged legal claims backed by the crown. He turned widows into beggars, disinherited children, and bankrupted entire families, all with a parchment and a seal. Perhaps the most infamous case involved the powerful de Clare family holdings in Glamorgan. When Eleanor's brother died without a male heir, the lands were meant to be divided among his sisters. Hugh, married Eleanor, argued that she deserved more, much more. Through a combination of legal pressure and royal decree, he claimed vast territories in South Wales, making himself the de facto overlord of the region. In Wales, his rule became synonymous with oppression. He treated the Welsh with cruelty, imposing harsh taxes, evicting native landholders, and brutally crushing dissent. The brutality escalated into what many historians have since described as a private reign of terror. Local officials were executed without trial. Villages were razed on suspicion of harboring rebels. Dissent was silenced not with words, but with the sword. And still, Edward II protected him. Every complaint brought before the king was dismissed. Every accusation, no matter how credible, was ignored. In the royal court, Despenser's enemies were not only silenced, they were often imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The halls of Westminster echoed not with debate or counsel, but with whispers of fear and quiet sobbing from those who had lost everything to Hugh's machinations. Yet Hugh was not satisfied with power alone. He wanted recognition. He pushed Edward to bestow upon him grander titles, greater lands, and more authority. In 1322, following the defeat of the rebel Thomas of Lancaster, Hugh was granted even more expansive lands and control over royal fortresses. This victory marked the peak of Hugh's dominance, and the point at which his tyranny became unbearable. He began using the courts to exact personal revenge. Nobles who had opposed him were brought before sham tribunals, stripped of lands, fined into poverty, or imprisoned indefinitely. Some were even hanged under obscure laws of treason, laws that Hugh conveniently discovered in old parchments or invented himself with Edward's signature. Foreign observers were horrified. Papal envoys and visiting diplomats described the English court as a place of corruption and despair. One chronicler wrote that, "No man dares speak freely, for the king is bewitched by a serpent." But perhaps most egregious was Hugh's treatment of Queen Isabella. Stripped of her influence, the queen was humiliated both publicly and privately. Her lands were seized, her allies were exiled, and her dignity was reduced to mere ceremonial presence. Despenser orchestrated surveillance over her, intercepted her letters, and ensured that her voice could not reach beyond the walls of her cold chambers. In doing so, he made a fatal mistake. Isabella, though silent, was not broken. Behind the veil of her courtly silence, she was plotting. Hugh's relentless assault on her honor had kindled a fury that would change the fate of England. She would bide her time and strike when the moment was right. Even as threats loomed, Hugh's arrogance knew no bounds. He flaunted his wealth openly, parading through London in jeweled robes and armored processions. He hosted banquets of absurd extravagance while peasants starved under his taxes. Every feast was a celebration of his unchecked ambition. But beneath the silver platters and golden goblets, the ground was beginning to shake. Secret meetings were being held in northern castles. Letters smuggled across the channel carried messages of rebellion. Exiled barons whispered Hugh's name not with fear, but with fury. They spoke of justice, of vengeance, of a reckoning long overdue. Hugh Despenser believed he was untouchable, that he had risen so high even God himself couldn't reach him. But the truth was far simpler. He wasn't above the law. He was a storm. And every storm, no matter how mighty, eventually breaks. In the shadows of Edward II's fractured court, where fear reigned and Hugh Despenser's tyranny went unchecked, a quiet storm was gathering. It wore a crown and held her rage behind regal eyes. Queen Isabella of France, wife of the king, daughter of Philip IV, had watched the kingdom crumble into chaos. Her husband had grown blind to suffering, deaf to protest, and utterly enslaved to the will of one man. That man was Hugh Despenser. But Isabella was no powerless consort. She was royal by blood, educated in diplomacy, fluent in the arts of war and politics, and above all, patient. For years, she had endured Hugh's domination of her husband and his systemic erosion of her dignity. She had suffered in silence as her lands were confiscated, her servants replaced, her allies imprisoned, and her voice extinguished from Edward's council. Yet in silence, she planned. The turning point came in 1325. Edward, facing growing unrest in Gascony, needed someone he could trust to negotiate with the French court. Ironically and foolishly, he chose Isabella. She was, after all, still the daughter of the French king, and thus the ideal intermediary. But sending Isabella to France would prove to be the gravest mistake of his reign. Once back in her homeland, the queen shed the shackles of surveillance. In France, there were no dispensers to monitor her, no royal guards to censor her speech. She reconnected with powerful allies, including her brother, now King Charles IV, and began to voice her disgust with Hugh's tyranny. To many, she was no longer just a sideline queen. She was a political exile seeking justice. There, in the glittering courts of Paris, she met another key figure, Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had escaped Despenser's prison and was living in exile. Their meeting was more than strategic. It was electric. Some said they became lovers. Others insist it was purely political. Whatever the truth, their bond forged a rebellion. Isabella and Mortimer crafted a bold plan, not just to return to England, but to return with an army. But first, they secured crucial support from disaffected nobles, foreign allies, and even the church. Pope John XXII, already wary of Edward's rule, turned a blind eye to the rebellion forming under his nose. The final blow came in 1326. Isabella, now openly defying her husband, landed on the English coast with Mortimer and a small mercenary force. But the moment their banners were raised, thousands flocked to them. English barons, tired of Despenser's cruelty and Edward's weakness, joined their cause with terrifying speed. Edward II and Hugh Despenser were caught off guard. The king, perhaps blinded by denial, failed to rally an effective defense. As Isabella marched inland, castle after castle surrendered without a fight. Cities opened their gates. The people cheered. The invasion became a revolution. Hugh and Edward fled west, hoping to regroup in the loyalist strongholds of Wales. But there was no sanctuary. In November of 1326, Edward was captured near Lanchesson. Days later, Hugh Despenser was seized alongside him. Filthy, starved, and terrified, the storm Isabella had waited years to unleash had finally broken. And now, justice would not be served quietly. The queen had no intention of granting Despenser a private death. His crimes had been public, his cruelty legendary. His punishment would be the same. She ordered him taken to Hereford, where a massive crowd gathered for the spectacle. He was tried as a traitor, not just to the king, but to the realm itself. The list of his offenses was long: unlawful executions, land theft, false imprisonments, manipulation of the crown, and the degradation of the monarchy. But the most damning charge of all was his intimate influence over Edward II, an accusation laced with whispers of sin and corruption that scandalized even the hardened spectators. There would be no mercy. The sentence was death, a death meant to humiliate, to horrify, and to signal the end of his reign of terror. The queen, once voiceless and sidelined, now stood as the harbinger of justice. She had turned her fury into revolution. She had turned rebellion into redemption. And Hugh Despenser, once the most powerful man in England, now stood before the gallows, his future carved in cruelty, his legacy drenched in blood. The cold November wind blew through the streets of Hereford as thousands gathered for a spectacle the likes of which England had rarely seen. Word had spread like wildfire. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's notorious favorite, was about to meet his end, but this would be no ordinary execution. Queen Isabella had ordered a sentence as brutal as the man's reputation, a death crafted to mirror his crimes. As Hugh was led through the jeering crowd, bound and filthy, he was almost unrecognizable. The once proud lord, who had paraded through London in jeweled robes and golden chains, was now a trembling shadow of himself. He wore no armor, no finery, only the tattered remnants of a man who had risen too high and fallen too hard. The charges against him had already been read days earlier in a court that served more as theater than law. But there was no question of guilt. The crimes were vast: unjust executions, unlawful confiscation of lands, suppression of the nobility, corruption of royal power, and most scandalously, his alleged unnatural influence over Edward II, a veiled accusation that he had not only controlled the king politically, but may have been involved in a relationship that challenged every moral norm of the time. Such rumors, though impossible to prove, were enough to inflame an already outraged public. The symbolism was clear. Hugh was not just a traitor. He was the corrupt heart of a diseased monarchy. And now, that heart would be excised in full view. Queen Isabella, though not present at the execution, had made her intentions clear. Hugh's death was to be a warning, a statement to all who thought themselves above the realm. And so, the sentence was read aloud again before the crowd. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most severe punishment in medieval England, reserved for traitors of the highest order. But first, he was to be humiliated. He was tied to a horse backward, facing his tail, as a mockery of his former status. Around his neck, they hung a board inscribed with his crimes. Spectators hurled insults and rotten food. The very people he had once taxed into poverty now rejoiced at his downfall. They had come not only to see him die, but to see justice breathe again. When he arrived at the scaffold, the real horror began. He was stripped naked and tied to a wooden frame. The executioners, under strict orders, moved slowly, methodically. First, he was hanged by the neck, but not to death, just enough to suffocate and weaken him, then cut down before unconsciousness took him fully. Then came the mutilation. He was castrated, a cruel echo of the charges of sexual corruption that had fueled the public's rage. His genitals were burned before his eyes, a grotesque ritual intended to shame him in life and erase him in death. As if that weren't enough, his abdomen was sliced open, and his entrails pulled from his body while he was still alive. The crowd recoiled in horror, but few turned away. After years of tyranny, the people demanded not just justice, but spectacle. His heart, the seat of his treachery, was torn from his chest and burned. Finally, his body was quartered, divided into 4 parts, each sent to a different city as a grim reminder. His head, impaled on a spike, was placed on London Bridge. It leered over the river, a grotesque monument to the cost of unchecked ambition. Thus ended the life of Hugh Despenser the Younger, not with dignity, not with defiance, but with screams and fire. His name, once whispered in fear through royal halls, became a curse on the lips of commoners. His legacy was not of power, but of cruelty. Yet in that final grisly moment, something else died as well. The illusion of Edward II's invincibility. The king, captured and stripped of his power, was now a prisoner in his own realm. Isabella and Mortimer stood triumphant, not just as rebels, but as restorers of the realm. But the story was far from over. For even in death, Hugh's shadow would linger. His influence had shaped a decade of English history, and his fall had reshaped the kingdom. And Edward, the king he had served and seduced, now faced the very fate he had once dealt to others. As the smoke from Hugh Despenser's pyre drifted into the winter sky, England held its breath. The tyrant was dead, but his master still lived, imprisoned, isolated, and stripped of power. King Edward II, once sovereign of the realm, now found himself little more than a royal embarrassment. Captured near Lanterson after a desperate flight across the Welsh countryside, Edward was betrayed by his few remaining allies and handed over to Queen Isabella's forces. The king who had ruled, or rather, allowed others to rule in his name, was now a prisoner of his own wife. He was not brought to trial. He was not allowed to plead his case. Instead, he was transported under heavy guard to Kenilworth Castle, a noble prison, but a prison all the same. There, behind cold stone walls and under constant watch, Edward awaited his fate. But his fate was already being written, not by him, but by Isabella and her new partner in power, Roger Mortimer. In London, the atmosphere was electric. Isabella, once marginalized and humiliated, now ruled in all but name. She was praised as the savior of the kingdom, the queen who had liberated the realm from Despenser's cruelty and her husband's incompetence. But her ambitions stretched further. If the realm was to be healed, Isabella reasoned, it could not be with Edward on the throne. His reputation was beyond repair. The barons no longer trusted him. The church had turned away. The people mocked his weakness, blamed him for the Despensers, and saw him as the architect of England's recent suffering. So, Isabella and Mortimer prepared a radical move, deposition. It would be the first time in English history that a reigning monarch was forced to abdicate by his own nobles, a dangerous precedent and a constitutional crisis. But the tide of support was undeniable. Parliament was summoned, and the Lords were presented with a choice: support Isabella's son, the young Edward, just 14, or risk civil war by backing a broken king. Edward II was presented with a choice in early 1327. Under intense pressure, isolated and aware of his own vulnerability, he signed the document of abdication. His crown passed to his son, now Edward III, while Isabella and Mortimer became regents, ruling in the boy's name. But even dethroned, Edward II remained a threat. Isabella knew this. So did Mortimer. As long as the former king lived, there existed a rallying point for resistance, a figurehead around whom the discontented could gather. There were still loyalists who saw Edward's deposition as an affront to divine order, who viewed Isabella's regency with suspicion, and Mortimer's rise as opportunistic. Thus began a grim chapter in Edward's life. A king no longer a king, moved like a pawn from one secure location to another. First Kenilworth, then Berkeley Castle. Always watched, never free. In these months, the once grand monarch lived in eerie silence. His guards were instructed to limit contact. Servants were chosen for loyalty, not sympathy. Letters were censored. Visits were forbidden. His world shrank to the size of a stone chamber. And with every passing week, whispers grew louder. Was he being tortured? Starved? Was his mind breaking under the weight of his fall? Or worse, was a darker plan unfolding? Many believed Mortimer and Isabella feared the inevitable, that someday some faction would rise up, free the former king, and plunge England into civil war. The solution, they concluded, was simple and final. On the night of September 21st, 1327, those whispers found a chilling end. It was said that Edward died in Berkeley Castle, under suspicious circumstances. The official story claimed natural causes, but few believed it. The more common tale, whispered by chroniclers and echoed through the centuries, is far more horrifying. They say his killers, not wanting to leave visible marks of murder, used a red-hot poker inserted into his body through a horn. It was a grotesque irony, a death meant to humiliate him in the same way Despenser had been humiliated, all while leaving no evidence of violence on the outside. True or not, the legend stuck. It became part of Edward's legacy, a brutal end for a weak king, betrayed by those closest to him. And so, Edward II, once ruler of England, died in the shadows. No crown, no court, no loyalists at his side. Just the cold silence of a prison cell and the weight of history pressing down. But this story, as grotesque and tragic as it seems, was not the end, because the very forces that rose to power by destroying him would soon face their own reckoning. From the one person they had most underestimated, Edward III. The death of Edward II was meant to be the final chapter in a bitter conflict, a clean break from a failed reign, a reset for England. But in their zeal for power, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer made a critical mistake. They underestimated the boy they had placed on the throne. Edward III was just 14 when he became king, young, quiet, and seemingly pliable. To the realm, it seemed a wise compromise. A new monarch with royal blood, but without the baggage of his father. But beneath his youthful face and courtly manners, a slow fire was building, one fueled by humiliation, betrayal, and a thirst for justice. In the early years of his reign, Edward III was king in name only. The real power lay with his mother and Mortimer. Together, they ruled England through a regency that quickly grew unpopular. Taxes remained high, favoritism continued, and the war with Scotland, a legacy of Edward II's mismanagement, dragged on with little success. Mortimer, in particular, had become everything he once claimed to oppose. He surrounded himself with loyalists, enriched his allies, and wielded authority as though he were king. He even adopted royal privileges, styling himself the Earl of March, wearing rogue's edge and ermine, and sitting beside Queen Isabella as her equal. Rumors swirled that the two were not merely political partners but lovers, and that they lived more lavishly than any monarch had dared. To the English nobility, it felt all too familiar. Mortimer was becoming another dispenser, and Edward III was watching and waiting. For years, the young king endured the humiliation of his own court being dominated by the very people who had murdered his father. He was paraded, praised, and posed for ceremonies, but his voice carried little weight. Mortimer ensured that anyone too close to the king was removed or silenced. Even Edward's household knights were chosen for loyalty to the regency, not to the crown. But Edward was no fool. He understood that patience was power. He cultivated quiet allies, noblemen, soldiers, and clerics who also grew wary of Mortimer's rule. He bided his time, studied his enemy, and prepared for the moment when the crown would truly be his. That moment came in October 1330. Edward, now 17, had matured into a poised and strategic young man. He was no longer the passive boy of 1327. He gathered a small group of loyal men and launched a daring coup at Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella had taken up residence in fortified luxury. Using a secret passage, later known as Mortimer's Hole, Edward and his men infiltrated the castle under cover of night. The guard were overpowered. Doors were flung open. Chaos erupted. Mortimer was dragged from Isabella's chambers, shouting and protesting. The queen, stunned, tried to intervene, but her son, the rightful king, stood firm. "I arrest you," Edward reportedly said, "in the name of the crown." Mortimer was taken to the Tower of London. Unlike the farcical trials he had overseen, Mortimer received a hearing. The charges were numerous: the unlawful execution of loyal nobles, the murder of Edward II, the usurpation of royal power, and the mismanagement of the realm. He was found guilty. He offered no real defense. On November 29th, 1330, Roger Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn, a traitor in the eyes of the law, a tyrant in the memory of the people. Unlike the Spencer, he was not drawn or quartered. Edward III chose to show restraint, perhaps to display his moral superiority, or perhaps as a final insult. Mortimer was not even worthy of spectacle. Queen Isabella was spared the noose, but not disgrace. She was confined to Castle Rising in Norfolk, stripped of her influence but allowed to live out her days in relative comfort. She would never again hold power, and her once glorious rebellion had become a cautionary tale. With Mortimer gone and Isabella deposed, Edward III took full control of his kingdom. He began one of the most celebrated reigns in English history, a warrior king who revitalized the monarchy, launched successful campaigns in the 100 Years' War, and helped shape England's identity for generations to come. But he never forgot the lessons of his youth. He had seen how power could corrupt, how ambition could turn allies into tyrants, and he had watched as those closest to him destroyed his father and nearly destroyed the crown itself. And so, from that day forward, Edward ruled not as a puppet, but as a king forged in betrayal and hardened by justice. The story of Edward II, Hugh Despenser, and Roger Mortimer did not fade with the swinging of the executioner's rope. Instead, it echoed across generations, a chilling reminder of how love, power, and betrayal can collide with devastating consequences. In the years following Mortimer's execution, England transformed under Edward III. His reign brought stability, military success, and a renewed sense of national pride. The young king who had once been controlled by others became a model of medieval kingship. But the shadow of his father's fall lingered, buried deep in the pages of history, and in the minds of those who lived through it. The legacy of Edward II's reign is complicated. Was he a weak king, manipulated by favorites? A tragic figure undone by love and loyalty? Or a misunderstood monarch caught in the unforgiving gears of power politics? Historians continue to debate these questions. Some portray Edward II as a man out of step with his time, more interested in personal relationships than statecraft, more inclined to delegate than command. His reign was marked by conflict, loss, and factionalism. The wars in Scotland were disastrous. His barons were perpetually angry, and his reliance on the Despensers pushed the kingdom into chaos. Yet others offer a more sympathetic view. Edward was not a warmonger. He showed mercy where others would have sought vengeance. He had genuine affections, perhaps even love, for Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, and he sought stability through those connections, however misguided. His downfall may have been due not to evil intent, but to emotional blindness and political naivety. And what of Hugh Despenser the Younger? To his enemies, he was a villain of the highest order, greedy, cruel, and insatiable in his thirst for power. He used his position to enrich himself and punish rivals. He oversaw torture, land seizures, and executions. His fall was greeted with celebration across the land. But Despenser's rise was not without reason. He was cunning, well-educated, and a master of court intrigue. In another time, his talents might have served a more capable king, or even preserved the throne he helped destroy. Instead, he flew too close to the sun and dragged Edward II down with him. Then there's Roger Mortimer, rebel, regent, and tyrant. His rebellion was born from genuine grievances. He had lost everything to the Despenser regime, and he fought back with bravery and resolve. But once in power, he mirrored the very despotism he had fought to overthrow. Isabella, too, remains a figure of fascination. The she-wolf of France, as later writers would call her, challenged expectations of queenship. She was intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely protective of her son. But she also became entangled in a dangerous relationship with Mortimer and enabled many of his excesses. Together, Mortimer and Isabella wrote one of the most dramatic chapters in medieval English history, one defined by passion, rebellion, and betrayal. But history has a long memory, and in the centuries that followed, the tragedy of Edward II took on new forms. In plays, novels, and operas, his story has been reimagined countless times. Christopher Marlowe's 16th century play Edward II painted the fallen king as a tragic hero, undone by his love for Gaveston, and the cruelty of a world that could not understand him. In more recent decades, scholars have explored Edward's sexuality, examining how personal identity may have shaped and doomed his reign. The gruesome death attributed to him, the red-hot poker, became symbolic of the ultimate humiliation. Whether fact or legend, it shocked audiences for centuries and underscored the brutality of the political world he inhabited. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Edward's fall is the question it raises about power itself. Who truly holds it? The crown? The court? The people? In the 14th century, power could shift in an instant, through marriage, betrayal, or even whispers in the dark. Edward II's story reminds us how fragile monarchy can be, how personal choices ripple through nations, and how those closest to the throne could be the most dangerous of all. His reign did not end in glory. There were no final victories, no redemption arcs in his lifetime. But his story, filled with intrigue, cruelty, and unexpected humanity, endures. It endures because it speaks to something deeper, a warning about favoritism, a tale of ambition turned toxic, and a meditation on what it means to be a ruler and a man, in a world where loyalty is a currency often spent too freely. The tale of Edward II, Despenser, Mortimer, and Isabella is not merely medieval gossip. It's a mirror held up to the darkest corners of power, and a story that still feels chillingly modern. The death of Edward II remains one of medieval England's most haunting mysteries. Was he murdered in a cold, calculated plot, or did he simply die of natural causes? As some official accounts claimed, the truth has been lost in the fog of time, but the stories that survive continue to captivate and horrify. Let's start with the official version. After Edward's abdication, he was held captive under strict guard, moved from castle to castle. The official records state that he died quietly in Berkeley Castle in September 1327, likely from illness exacerbated by his imprisonment. This explanation was convenient. It avoided scandal, quelled potential unrest, and preserved the image of the monarchy. But unofficial accounts tell a far darker tale. Chroniclers, many sympathetic to Edward or opposed to Mortimer and Isabella, claimed the former king was murdered to prevent any chance of his restoration. The most notorious story suggests Edward was killed by a red-hot poker inserted into his body, a gruesome method meant to leave no outward marks and to inflict a slow, agonizing death. Why such a cruel method? Some historians speculate it was designed to ensure no visible wounds that could be used as evidence of foul play, thus masking the murder as natural death. However, skepticism exists around this narrative. The red-hot poker story first appears decades after Edward's death, raising questions about its reliability. Some argue it may have been propaganda crafted by Edward's enemies or dramatized by later writers. Other theories propose different causes: starvation, neglect, or more traditional forms of execution. Still, no definitive proof exists. In recent years, historians and forensic experts have examined the possibilities. Some even suggest Edward may have lived for some time after his reported death, hiding in secret or under a different identity. Though these claims remain speculative, the mystery deepens when we consider political motivations. For Isabella and Mortimer, Edward was a dangerous liability. His existence threatened their power. A dead king was no longer a rival, and the new regime could rule without fear of rebellion rallying behind a deposed monarch. Thus, the motive for murder was clear. But who carried it out? Was it Mortimer himself, one of his henchmen, or someone acting independently? The historical record is silent. And what of the queen who once loved him? Isabella's role is debated fiercely. Was she complicit? Did she sanction the killing to secure her son's throne? Or was she sidelined by Mortimer's ambitions and kept in the dark? No conclusive evidence answers these questions. What remains undeniable is that Edward II's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a political act, a brutal reminder of the stakes involved in medieval power struggles. In death, as in life, Edward was a symbol of loyalty and betrayal, weakness and resistance, humanity caught in the harsh mechanisms of kingship. The story of his death continues to inspire books, films, and scholarly debates, a testament to the enduring fascination with this tragic king who dared to be different and paid the ultimate price. As we reach the end of this tale, it's time to reflect on the legacy of Edward II, Hugh Despenser, and Roger Mortimer, and the lessons their stories leave us today. Edward II's reign was short and tragic, marked by personal loyalties that clashed violently with political realities. His downfall reminds us how dangerous favoritism can be in leadership, how placing trust in the wrong hands can unravel even a kingdom. Hugh Despenser's rise and brutal fall illustrate the corrupting influence of unchecked ambition and power. His story warns that those who serve a leader must never lose sight of justice and mercy, for tyranny breeds rebellion. Roger Mortimer, once a victim of tyranny himself, became a tyrant in his own right. His story teaches that power seized through betrayal often sows the seeds of its own destruction. And then there's Isabella, a queen who challenged conventions and wielded power in an era when few women could. Her actions were both bold and controversial, highlighting the complex role of women in medieval politics. But beyond the individuals, this story speaks to timeless themes. The delicate balance of power, between ruler and subject, between personal affection and public duty, the dangers of political intrigue, how betrayal can come from the closest allies, and the human cost of ambition, the lives shattered and histories rewritten. Edward II's story continues to resonate because it humanizes kingship. It shows that rulers are not just symbols or figures of authority, but fallible people with desires, fears, and vulnerabilities. His reign may have ended in disgrace and violence, but it paved the way for reform and renewal under his son, Edward III. The lessons learned from his failures shaped the monarchy's evolution. In the end, the story of Castrated and Condemned, the king's most trusted betrayed, is more than medieval history. It is a cautionary tale about power, loyalty, and the high price of betrayal, one that echoes through time and reminds us to guard carefully what we hold dear. Thank you for joining the Crit Stories for this gripping journey into one of history's most tragic betrayals. If you found this story compelling, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales of intrigue, mystery, and history. Until next time, keep seeking the stories behind history.